The painting we want to talk about tonight is Albert Bierstadt's Mount Hood, which was painted in 1869. And this painting was really important to me because unlike a lot of the works in the collection of the Portland Art Museum, this is like our, to use a sports metaphor, this is our home field. This is our, our home stadium. This is something that we all have an experience with. And so for me, I thought it would be really interesting to think about how did Albert Bierstadt see Mount Hood in the Columbia River Gorge in 1869 versus how do we see that, the Columbia River Gorge on our weekend trips perhaps in 2009. It was actually at the beginning of photography. And so there was a lot of sketches, a lot of photographs, a lot of thinking. And over his trip, he went to places all across the West. So he might have been thinking about Mount Hood, but he was also thinking about Yosemite or Mount Shasta or all these other places in the West. So it all gets I think it gets jumbled up a little bit. So let's put this into context. When Bierstadt would have exhibitions, which would be more or less one painting. This is the equivalent of a Hollywood blockbuster circa 1869. So just in the same way that we don't go up to kind of George Lucas and James Cameron and say, hey, wait a second, we don't really have things flying in space. Is it kind of the same fair criticism to go back to Bierstadt and say, okay, well, the landscape really doesn't look that way? The answer is probably not. It was for a different time, it was for a different audience. And it really was much more like our movies rather than being kind of for paintings. So then you got to think, well, what is the purpose of this painting? He is a New York painter. He has exhibitions both in San Francisco, in New York, in Europe. Who's the audience for this painting? When he leaves Portland on December 17th, 1863, soon after, his name had actually come up to fight in the Civil War. And I think that that's actually really important because this is it's a time of conflict. It's a time of kind of violence. It's a time in which the country is literally tearing itself apart. And being from New York, he's German, but he's part of the Hudson River School. By being in New York, I think that I can't help but to think that the tensions that were leading to the Civil War would probably be kind of one of the defining moments in your life. And I think that one of the release valves is actually to quote, look at nature, look at the landscape, look at something completely different than kind of the fighting over slavery, the things that were really tearing our country apart. So if on the one hand, when you're looking at this painting, I want you to kind of think about the Civil War. Because I think in some ways that when Bierstadt is kind of looking and talking about it and painting his landscapes, he's looking for an alternative. He's looking for kind of another way of living. He's looking for something that's kind of beyond kind of the everyday, the hassles that can't be solved, that can only be solved with kind of gunshots. This is not the angle or the version of Mount Hood that we see when you're looking from the Columbia River Gorge. This is actually the Mount Hood that we see from Portland. So already it's almost like a proto-cubism, a proto-Cezanne kind of approach to painting. It's not about the reality, it's about the idea. So if we accept that this painting then is not about a real landscape, it's about an idea, well, what does that mean for us? Because when we're going out and driving through the gorge, it doesn't look anything like this. So all of a sudden we have this sort of disjunction. On the one hand, we have kind of Bierstadt's vision, right? Bierstadt's fighting the Civil War, thinking about the Civil War, trying to create kind of the landscape as a cathedral. On the other hand, we have this idea that when we go driving in the gorge, it doesn't look anything like this. Well, which one is real? Which one is kind of important? How do we kind of merge these different ideas? Do we kind of chalk it up to kind of artistic license and say, okay, well, Bierstadt was allowed to make his own decisions about what the landscape should be? Or is it important that we sort of stand our ground and say, well, how do we find a way, to work out of this? And I can understand the idea of kind of painting an Eden as kind of, if you want to oppose kind of the Civil War, if you wanted to kind of paint exactly the opposite of what's going on in that time. But at the same time, what happens is I think that his ideas about the landscape become much more difficult to handle because they don't fit with our reality of how we actually experience the Columbia River Gorge. It's not the way that we see it. And I think that that's the sort of the central kind of point, or the issue that I want to focus on tonight is that issue between the way that Bierstadt saw it The way that Bierstadt saw kind of the landscape as sort of a respite from the Civil War versus how we see the Columbia River Gorge. Because, I mean, the Columbia River Gorge is a place that we all spend our weekends. You know, we go hiking in, we might go traveling. It's a place that we're familiar with. Each of us already have a history with this. So how does our history either match or doesn't match with Bierstadt's? I think that these paintings are really almost about God and the landscape, I would say.